I'm delighted that everybody actually that I invited has agreed to be part of the panel. I'm going to start off with Professor Bobby Banerjee. He's Professor of Management at City University in London. He's also one of the core members of Ethos, the Centre for Responsible Enterprise, and has been crucial in terms of convening two big workshops around decolonizing the business school curriculum over the last probably 9 months. I was at the second one, the one in January, and really that was gave me some focus and direction in terms of this area, and it's really from there that we've started to engage with these kinds of debates within BAFA as well, and amongst some of us in the critical accounting community. So Bobby will speak first, and then we've then got Nadine de Gannes, who's an associate professor of managerial accounting and control and sustainability at Ivey Business School in Ontario, in Canada, who has experience again of listening projects, changing the curriculum at Ivey, in particular in relation to a common first year module, and the way that has trying to bring in various different perspectives there. And Nadine in particular today is going to talk about case study method in teaching. And then finally we've Diane-Laure Arjalies, who is also an assistant professor, managerial accounting and control, general management and sustainability at Ivey, who's been working on decolonizing and then indigenizing the accounting curriculum at Ivey. So without further ado, Bobby, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Stuart, for inviting me, and thanks for people for joining in. It's great to see the momentum growing. And Stuart, when I'm coming to the end of my 5-7 minutes, just feel free to interrupt me and stop, because I have much more, prefer to have much more time for discussion. I have one slide. I was thinking whether I should share it or not, but can you guys see this? Yeah. All right. So let me start with, I guess, talk about some of the issues arising from the workshop. As Stuart said, we've had 2 workshops widely attended, 247 business schools across 39 countries. And these are some of the thoughts I had before we put this together, and also after the workshop was done. And some of this might sound a bit negative and cynical, but bear with me. I'm sure the others are following me. We'll give you a more positive message. And the more I thought about this, the more I realized that decolonizing the business school, per se, not the curriculum, is not going to be possible. I'm just going to try and give you some of the reasons, I guess, why I came to this conclusion, and some of the possibilities which we could try and see if we could recover. So first of all, we got to make it very clear that when we talk about decolonizing the business school, it is ultimately about looking at the challenges posed by capitalism, because capitalism and colonialism are almost inseparable. This is the theoretical basis, for those of you who know the literature, on decolonization, on decoloniality. So when the dean asked me to head a task force on decolonizing the business school curriculum, I did mention to him that if you read the literature, that you can decolonize only after you destroy capitalism. That will make for a very interesting but rapidly extinct business school. And he just said, oh, no, let's not worry about capitalism. Let's just see what we can do. But if you think about it, it's quite obvious, isn't it? I mean, every single high school economics textbook talks about, the 4 factors of production: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. Land and labor is inextricably tied with colonialism. How can you separate our concepts of land from colonial histories, right? Which is responsible for almost all the problems we're facing in the developing world. So you can't separate that out. And the same thing goes with labor, right? From slavery, which was an integral part of historical capitalism, to modern slavery today, which is an integral part of neoliberal capitalism. You can't really separate those out, right? So capitalism, by definition, is racial capitalism in the way it's history. So it's not that difficult to kind of see why are we talking about decolonization and capitalism in the same breath, right? So you really cannot distinguish that fact. So that is a major assumption we need to keep in the forefront. Now, some of the liberals would argue it's possible to reform capitalism. You don't have to get rid of it. And that's a different debate. And perhaps I think this is where some more of the positive or the progressive ideas could be incorporated, but I'm not holding my breath. So at best, business schools who say they want to decolonize can try and diversify their curriculum by including voices of Black people and people of color. Diversity is not decolonization. This should be a self-evident proposition. As Angela Davis reminds us, diversity is the difference that makes no difference. Diversity is the change that brings about no change. Right? This is a depoliticized, sanitized version of decolonization. So I think we got to be very careful we don't fall into the trap, especially now that equity, diversity, inclusion, EDI has now become every vice chancellor's mantra. We have to be very, very careful that this is not the same. I'm not anti-diversity, but diversity does not mean the same as decolonization, right? But what is also apparent 2 years, well, more than a year now since George Floyd's murder, or public execution, shall we say, that the momentum built by Black Lives Matter continues to grow, despite the report which has come out in this country, which is why I'm wondering, Stuart, why are we having this conversation? According to the report, there is no structural racism in the UK. So I think we should immediately end this right now and go back to our day jobs. So anyway, what is quite apparent on the streets, both in this country and the US, that the momentum continues to grow. So in the workshop, as I said, we were blown away with very little advertising. I wanted to keep it small. We had 611 signups across the world. So obviously this is something which is right now people are trying to get their heads around. It is also true that there are many business school educators who want to engage in this conversation. It came out quite clearly, and also in the mainstream, in the belly of the beast, the Academy of Management, for the first time, I never thought I would live to hear that phrase. For the first time, the Academy of Management has used the term racial injustice instead of the word diversity. So there's obviously an understanding that this is something else is going on, right? So this provides an opportunity to understand, to get our heads around this, right? The other problem is if we're talking about a genuine engagement in decolonizing, we have to link structures of colonialism to the curriculum, right? And this is not an easy task. Very few people, and certainly in my school, there's nobody in the school which has the expertise to do this. There's a lot of discomfort amongst academics who are saying, I can't do this. I feel like an imposter. I don't know this literature. You're asking me now to talk about this stuff, which is a very important point. And we don't want this to be a decol light just to tick a box. And this is going to take some structural change because most academics and business schools don't have this basic, right? So having said that, there's some very creative ways I've seen, the least expected. One of our finance professors who teaches statistics started talking about Francis Galton, who's the father of a lot of things, including eugenics, and took a lot of his statements to the class and said, if this was his view about race, about white supremacy, how do we then make sense of the other stuff? And for the first time in an actuarial science statistics class, in an MBA, people talked about race. I don't think the word race ever came up in 70 years of talking about statistics. So I think those small ways, there are ways to do this. Another topic in stats, we looked at big data, which everybody is now all over. We talked about the racial bias in algorithms, how that works. And there's a lot of research coming out on that. So yes, there are some ways we need to link it, and that becomes a challenge as well. Anti-racism cannot be simply framed as a diversity project without understanding the colonial structures of racial injustice. To simply say diversity without understanding the history of that, you can't really face. Everybody's anti-racist, right? It's not enough to say, I have a passion for diversity. You have to show that you understand, you engage with the literature, engage with the policy, for example. How many people have we seen get up and speak out against this ridiculous report which came out, right? There have been the usual voices, but in the main, the academy has been silent about this report, which basically means that they agree with the findings, which is that there is no structural racism in this country, right? The structural consequences of colonialism need to be taught in our classrooms, and this is where it goes from the abstract or the past, that slavery is over, racism is over, we're in a post-racial world, to what is happening today. So I teach a module on climate change, and I talk about climate injustice and climate colonialism. The people who are dying and suffering the most because of climate change are the people who have contributed the least to the problem. The people who should be dying are not dying, if you want to talk about justice. So we look at issues of contemporary economics of dispossession. How does those legacies continue to operate today, right? So that bring it back to the real world. And almost to the end, the ninth part, I said 10 commandments, there will be let me rephrase that. There is a backlash against decolonization. The Lester's targeted redundancies are clearly aimed at a particular group of people. There will be a student backlash. One of the most poignant moments of the workshop is when a senior lecturer said one of the comments she got in her MBA evaluation from a student was that I have not paid all this money to be taught by a Black woman. That was a student comment. So as students that are customers who are paying $40,000 for an MBA, should we take this seriously and not have Black people teach finance, for example? So there will be a backlash, and there is already happening a backlash. How do we deal with this, right? And finally, if business school leaders, which I mean by deans, vice chancellors, do not accept the above points, then decolonizing the business school is just not possible. So let's not kid ourselves with what we're trying to do. Thank you. I'm sure we'll pick up some of these points in the discussion.
That's great.
Let me stop sharing. Yeah.
Cheers, Bobby. Thanks very much. I think laying out the theoretical context very well for us, and not pulling any punches either, which I think is very important in this discussion. So if we'll move on we'll go through the panelists first, discuss them together. Lots of really interesting ideas. I've been noting some of them down there that we can we'll pick up on in the discussion. So thanks again, Shani. So over to Nadine.
Thank you, Stuart. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm trying to be conscious of the time difference, or wherever you are. I'm in Canada. So I'm Trinidadian. I'm going to say a few things about myself to position where I'm coming from, and also link back a little bit to why that positionality is so important in how we teach our students. So I was born and raised in Trinidad, raised in an interracial, interreligious home, Christian, Hindu, and Muslim parents, grandparents. And Black and brown Caribbean would be how I identify sort of racially and ancestrally. But as has been noted, I experienced a British colonial education. And in many ways, actually, through what we might describe as internalized racism, which is probably part of how I'm experiencing the British recent report on no structural barriers is how internalized much of our racism is, even within our post-colonial populations. And so very much romanticized British education and landed at London School of Economics for my master's and my PhD. So I've been in a very recent journey of reflecting deeply on systems and what that has meant for my choices and who I am and how I occur in the world. So with that, I'm actually going to talk about case learning, because I also went to school for my first degree, and I'm now back in Canada at Ivey, which is a case-based teaching and learning institution. We're the second largest producer of cases after Harvard. And what's interesting about today, actually, is 100 years ago today, the first Harvard Business School case study was published. And a big question to ask right now, I think, in the context of the materials that we use when we think about decolonizing the curriculum and decolonizing the business school, is the medium that we use. And some of the words that come to mind in the case method, or at least resonate when I look at different anecdotes that are shared about it, is that it's a real world experience. It's real world challenges. And there are facts that are presented in the case. And one of the really beautiful things I took from the first workshop that City put on last July, and I've captured it and I use it often, is when many are uncomfortable with the term, decolonizing the curriculum, I remember some other words that we used in that workshop, and it's asking a question of who creates knowledge, who is knowledge created for, who benefits from knowledge. And so we need to problematize in the context of the case method and case studies, who we are creating knowledge for, so that when we pick up the words case fact, we recognize that when they occur as neutral and objective, they are actually incredibly value-laden. And they reflect a dominant culture, often, overwhelmingly. And that dominant culture actually shifts according to what geography it's often written in. And so I'm finding myself, as I'm reviewing, this sort of uptick in EDI cases that are being produced around the globe, there's a dominant culture everywhere. Now, overwhelmingly, as we experience it in the West, that's Euro-American centric, white. And Bobby did speak to that in the context of capitalism and sort of where that conversation needs to be happening because of the sort of interconnections. But not to take us through a history lesson there, but to return to the protagonists in our cases, the context, you know, in thinking that we have real world issues and real world challenges, is to define the world in one particular way. And so we have to open up the case method for the 21st century to think about those constructs and how unproblematic, how unquestioned, how taken for granted they've become, when what we also understand about our widening student body, our very increasingly diverse student body, is we can't achieve inclusion when they can't bring themselves to the space. And so I'm picking up on what Ishani was saying as well, is that students are deeply aware of what that dominant culture is. They understand how to norm into their social groups in a way that denies them parts of their identity. And they don't bring it to the space because that logic is so powerful. And so for them, for early success to happen, considering the age at which we meet many of our undergraduate students, they are navigating that identity. We have to make identity central to the learning experience so that when we speak to a case context in the way that I come to you first and I tell you what I believe is salient for me, that we will be modeling for our students what we understand to be salient about our own identities so that they can find that language to make it salient for themselves. And I've said to my students, for example, you know, when I'm triggered sometimes in a space, I can't, it's seldom my race actually. And I grew up in Trinidad, where I was part of the dominant race. And I didn't have to experience it until I was outside of Trinidad. I actually experienced my gender first, unless it's overtly racist experience. But that was a process of understanding what is happening for me in a space when I feel threatened, or I feel undermined, or I feel insulted. And because our positionality is so many parts of ourselves, getting very clear on that language and modeling that for our students helps them to bring that into the space, helps that space to be welcome to the multiplicity of things that are happening in a learning environment. So, you know, what we've seen in some of the research already done, you know, early successes for students where that identity is welcome allows that kind of success to persist for them in the learning environment. So cases, you know, as interactive and as fun and as engaging as they are, it's an opportunity for co-creation, and we need to center ourselves in the language of what co-creation can look like. And so it's not accepting that these cases are massively contextualized. They seem to be because we bought into that language of the real world and the case protagonists' case facts. We need to problematize that they're contextualized in a very narrow way, and we need to contextualize the identities in the space so that co-creation of knowledge can occur, that we can be raising those voices. And so that when you speak to a point, you're speaking to what's most salient for you in interaction with what is being presented as a fact, because multiple truths exist in a space. And so we need to start being quite clear about that and destabilizing these ideas about objectivity and facticity. That's me for right now.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Nadine. Again, really important and interesting insights. And yeah, I would like to be able to say that, of course, I knew about the Harvard anniversary today and delivered, but no, I didn't. But anyway, Diane, over to you.
Hi, everybody. So I am in London, Ontario. I'm 3 kilometers from Nadine, but we cannot be together because we're in a full lockdown, unfortunately. So I'm going to speak also a bit about my history and where I came. I come from France. And so I was raised in the elite system in France, you know, when you're good at maths and philosophy and you just got scholarship and you go to the Grande École, the elite schools, and you believe everything is about Paris. Like, it didn't even, for me, like the US scholars were not really educated in my mind, you know, when I was taught as an undergrad student, everything was about Paris and the French philosophers. And so I purposely was faculty member at HEC Paris in the Department of Accounting. And so when I moved to Ivey 6 years ago, almost 5 years ago, my first question when I had the training was, what do we do with the religious science? Because in France, it's forbidden. So you cannot accept a student who's going to wear a hijab or having a visible religious signs, you know? And the Ivey faculty training people, they looked at me and they were like they didn't understand the question. Like they thought I was a bit nuts, you know? And for me, it was the opposite. That was really surprising that you could reveal your own identity and your religion in a public space that was a university. And I think it speaks also to this notion of positionality right now, and this notion of where do we come from a cultural perspective, and how I don't think we can commit to decolonization if we're not committing ourselves on a personal journey. I think this is the very first time. I'm an ethnographer as well. I've done a lot of ethnographic work. And it's the first time when I came to my ethnographic work where my French origins were put together in the work itself, you know. And so that's, it's important as well to acknowledge the personal journey and where we are there. And also we talked about that with Nadine, to accept our own vulnerabilities and what we don't know and where we don't know what to do. So with this in mind, I'm teaching a class which is called Impact Assessment, which doesn't exist, of course. There's no textbook, there was no case study. And I was like, yeah, because otherwise I'm getting bored, you know, what about putting some challenges on my desk as to get more busy? And this class is to basically, we do a field work base, and we work with organizations, and we do whatever impact assessment they want. So we can assess the impact of the business, we can assess the impact of the social, like the charity, whatever they want, we can do it. And so for those who are familiar, we use a theory of change. This is my framework. Basically, you try to see what the impact you're looking at and how you're going to treat the impact, and you put some proxies and the inputs, like just for the accountants in the room here, it just sounds familiar. And over the years, I started meeting some indigenous populations here as neighbors, as friends, I became friends. And then I realized how much westernized I was, you know, like I really realized that internalized the white male, European white male model, that I would really try to be this white European male in my professional life and personal life, like no emotion and, you know, successful person publishing. And then it was like a bit of a wake up. So what I decided to do is I said, okay, let's try something different. Let's try to decolonize this class, and maybe let's try to indigenize it with indigenous communities. So decolonization is me, I'm a settler, so I have to engage in this path of decolonizing myself. It's not the job of the role of the indigenous communities. Indigenizing is to bring their own perspective on the knowledge production and knowledge sharing. And so I talked to some few indigenous communities, and we have 8 projects for the fieldwork over 1 semester, and half of them was with indigenous communities. And I have done that over the past 3 years. And the idea is to mix the different register of knowledge, both those who are working with non-indigenous communities and those who are working with indigenous communities. So all my class and my students are working together. And so I'm just going to share with you a little picture. So this is a final presentation. So they have to present at the very end. And usually my students are business school students. They like PowerPoints. They ask me whether they should put a suit to get the presentation. And I told them, no, whatever, it's just, you know, it's cold, don't come, like get dressed a little. It's December. And so this group asked me whether they could go outside. And I said, no worry, go outside. So we are outside the campus here. As you see, it's a big campus. It's a North American campus. And what they're doing here is they're basically telling a story of the impact assessment. So instead of putting numbers, instead of putting a slide deck together, they basically wrote a story, and they just did it as a theater. And here you have this person are from the indigenous community. They come, it's 2.5 hours. And these are one of the students, one of the group. This is a little cool here. And I'm going to show you a little screen as well here. This is what you can see here. So basically what they did is that they presented impact assessments. It was about empowerment of youth. It was a youth training on the community. And they put here what was the impact here and what we have it here. And they told the story. And for me, that was an interesting element, because this is really something about sharing and producing the knowledge differently. But to go there, they needed to have some training. So what we did as well is that it was before COVID, all of the students working with Indigenous community had to go on the reserve. And for most of the Canadians in the room, that was the first time. They were actually going into a reserve and exchanging, and they had to spend time. And I say, you take the full day, my friend, like it's part of it, you know, and I want you to tell me what's going on and everything. Also, I'm doing a co-teaching with some Indigenous communities, especially here. I'm fully grateful. This gentleman's named Clint Jacobs, is an Indigenous conservationist, very, very active. And he has been working with the universities, is happy to work with the business school. And so we've been talking together and bringing what for them impact meant. What was accounting for them, and then what it has the Indigenous communities, and this Wapo Island, but we had worked with others like Chippewa of the Thames, also in Alberta, and so it has them. Okay, tell us what the dream will be for you. If you have to account for what you do when you receive money, for the government, what would be the system of accounting that you would like to design? Okay, and then I ask the student, I say, you start from there. This is the departure point. I don't want you to start with standards. I don't want you to start with accounting 101. I want you to start with the desire, the values, the vision, and then they create something completely differently. They create stories, they create pictures, they create narratives. And this is how we did a bit. So it's a bit of a concrete example of how we can try to decolonize and indigenize. I have to say that my students have never been exposed to Indigenous knowledge before. So it's a big journey for them to come to this class, coming from business school and having no training, having no experience. There's a lot of fear. So there's a bit of a journey here where I'm doing a bit of a training. I try to make them discuss. We have discussion section, and this is something we achieve. So far has been quite interesting over the past years. We try to somehow design some case studies to be able to teach that as well. So design case study and impact assessment. I haven't yet designed the case study on impact assessment with Indigenous knowledge, but I hope we're going to do that and work with Nadine. So it's a bit of an overview of one initiative here. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Diane. So we've got plenty of time now. I'll open this out to anybody on the call. There's not that many of us, so we don't necessarily have to go through the kind of raise hand function and so on. If colleagues just want to turn the camera on or unmute themselves.
For the Big Four. And I think if you take that perspective, your actual teaching will change. What you teach will change, how you teach will change.
That's great. Thanks, Rob. I think the just kind of 2 points maybe to finish up. One of the things we were talking about is kind of practical steps and what can we do, and the discussions about the examples that have happened in other institutions and what we can bring back to our own institutions then as well, and engage with the discussions that are ongoing there. I think that as an immediate first step, I think there is stuff that we can do individually and maybe collectively in our networks to defend people who are subject to the backlash. Bobby mentioned Leicester earlier, and Diane's mentioned about what's going on in France. You know, you've seen, a lot of colleagues here will have seen the open letter that the editors from CPA put out, the blog that's been on the European Accounting Association website about Leicester as well. We're looking to do something through BAFA as the Learned Society for Accounting and Finance Academics. We need to be able to, or we should as a bare minimum be looking to protect the diversity and plurality that's actually in our discipline. when it's being put under attack in the way that it is at Leicester at the moment. So the stuff that we can do, practical ways in terms of defending people who are under attack at the moment, and also then kind of next steps. One of the things I've been talking to Tevan, who's the president of BAFA at the moment, we're hoping to then take this kind of format and actually do it as a standalone BAFA webinar, and try and encourage more members to come along and open up this debate at some point in the next kind of 2 or 3 months. And I suppose at university level, at your own institution level, I'm sure all the panelists would be happy if it worked with their work schedules to actually come along and to discuss and to talk to other groups. And so if we can go from this kind of group here and actually break up into smaller groups in our own institutions and start to get the discussions and the conversations going, I think that will be a continued good step for us from here. Any last points, comments? One of the things.
Last one. As long as we're breathing, there should be optimism. I feel like it's our responsibility. If we're alive, we're fighting. So that is my last comment.
Right. All right.
I'd like to, Karen's point about dialogue. I think that also is something that has diminished over the years, especially like with these large class sizes and all that. But the same dialogue needs to be done with students, and this kind of what people were talking about, co-curriculum, co-development of the curriculum. I think that is a positive thing for the future. We really need to increase dialogue with our students, and also as an academy. If everything's moving online, we need to, this is our way to show the physicality of the university, that to bring whole people together and to take them on field trips. I've taken my students regularly on field trips. And actually, when you take them onto a field, onto a particular organization or whatever, the whole context and the discussion changes, and they grow so much in confidence themselves, and they start to see a subject from the inside out rather than the outside in. So there are so many possibilities in this direction. And I think the last point, which some of you touched upon, is the empowerment of the minorities. I mean, Stuart, BAFA is championing diversity within the leadership of BAFA and the membership of BAFA, etc. And, here is a great opportunity to do that, because up till now, a lot of these minority voices have been marginal and have been silenced and have been disempowered, right? Now with decolonizing, we are almost saying that actually your voice matters. We want to listen to your voice. And I see that coming through in some of these conversations. So I think those are the possibilities.
And also, Stuart, before we go, well-being is so important. This work is tiring. Look after yourself. It's really tiring.
Yeah. Well, workloads is a whole nother issue, isn't it? Yeah. But thanks for the comments. Okay, listen, I'll end it here now. We have got this